Cricket on the Hearth, A Fairy Tale Home, December 1845. Chapter 1. Chirp the First. The kettle began it. Don't tell me what Mrs. Peerybingle said. I know better. Mrs. Peerybingle may leave it on record to the end of time that she couldn't say which of them began it. Full 5 minutes before the little waxy-faced Dutch clock in the corner, before the cricket uttered a chirp. As if the clock hadn't finished striking, and the convulsive little haymaker at the top of it jerking away right and left with a scythe in front of Moorish Palace hadn't mowed down half an acre of imaginary grass before the cricket joined in at all. Why? I am not naturally positive. Everyone knows that. I wouldn't set my own opinion against the opinion of Mrs. Peerybingle, but unless I were quite sure on any count whatever, nothing should induce me. But this is a question of fact. And the fact is, that the kettle began it at least 5 minutes before a cricket gave any sign of being in existence. Contradict me, and I'll say 10. Let me narrate exactly how it happened. I should have proceeded to do so my very first word, but for this plain consideration, if I am to tell a story, I must begin at the beginning. And how is it possible to begin at the beginning without beginning at the kettle? It appeared as if there were some sort of match, or a trial of skill, we must understand, between the kettle and the cricket. And this is what led to it, and how it came about. Mrs. Peerybingle, going out into the raw twilight and clicking over the wet stones in a pair of paddens that worked innumerable rough impressions of the first proposition of Euclid all about the yard. Mrs. Peerybingle filled the kettle of the water butt, presently returning less to paddens and a good deal less, for they were tall and Mrs. Peerybingle was but short. She set the kettle on the fire, in doing which she lost her temper or mislaid it for an instant, for the water being uncomfortably cold, and in that slippy, slushy, sleety sort of state, wherein it seems to penetrate through every kind of substance, padded rings included, had laid a hold of Mrs. Peerybingle's toes. It even splashed her legs. And when we rather plumed ourselves, with reason to, upon our legs, and kept ourselves particularly neat in point of stockings, we find this, for the moment, hard to bear. Besides, the kettle was aggravating and obstinate. It wouldn't allow itself to be adjusted on its hot bar. It wouldn't hear of adjusting itself kindly to the knobs of coal. It would lean forward with a drunken air and dribble, a very idiot of a kettle, on the hearth. It was quarrelsome, and hissed and spluttered morosely at the fire. To sum up all, the lid, resisting Mrs. Peerybingle's fingers, first of all turned topsy-turvy, and then, with an ingenious pertinacity, deserving of a better cause, dived sideways in, down to the very bottom of the kettle. And the hull of the Royal George has never made half of the monstrous resistance to coming out of the water, which the lid of that kettle employed against Mrs. Peerybingle before she got it up again. It looked sullen and pig-headed enough even then, carrying its handle with an air of defiance, and cocking its spout pertly and mockingly at Mrs. Peerybingle, as if it said, "I won't boil. Nothing shall induce me." But Mrs. Peerybingle, with restored good humor, dusted her chubby little hands against each other and sat down before the kettle, laughing. Meantime, the jolly blaze uprose and fell, flashing and gleaming on the little haymaker at the top of the Dutch clock, until one might have thought he stood stock still before the Moorish palace, and nothing was in motion but the flame. He was on the move, however, and had his spasms, to the second, all right and regular. But his sufferings from the clock was going to strike, and were frightful to behold. And when a cuckoo looked out of the trapdoor in the palace and gave note 6 times, it shook him, each time, like a spectral voice, or something wiry plucking at his legs. It was not until a violent commotion and whirring noise among the weights and ropes below him had quite subsided that this terrified haymaker became himself again. Nor was he startled without reason, for these rattlings, bony skeletons of clocks are very disconcerting in their operation, and I wonder very much how any set of men, but most of them all how Dutchmen, can have had the liking to invent them. There is a popular belief that Dutchmen love broad cases and much clothing for their own lower selves, and they might know better than to leave their clocks so very lank and unprotected, surely. Now it was, you observed, that the kettle began to spend the evening. Now it was that the kettle, growing mellow and musical, began to have irrepressible gurglings in its throat, and to indulge in short vocal snorts, which it checked in the bud, as if it hadn't quite made up its mind yet to be quite good company. Now it was that after 2 or 3 such vain attempts to stifle its convivial sentiments, it threw off all moroseness, all reserve, and burst into a stream of song, so cozy and hilarious as never maudlin's nightingale yet formed the least idea of. So plain, too, bless you, you might have understood it like a book. Better than some books you or I could name, perhaps, with its warm breath gushing forth in a light cloud which merrily and gracefully ascended a few feet, and then hung about the chimney corner as its own domestic heaven. It trolled its song with that strong energy of cheerfulness, that its strong iron body hummed and stirred upon the fire, and the lid itself, the recently rebellious lid, such is the influence of a bright example, performed such a jig, and clattered like a deaf and dumb young cymbal that had never known the use of its twin brother. That this song of the kettles was a song of invitation and welcome to somebody out of doors, to somebody at the moment coming on towards the snug small home and the crisp fire, there is no doubt whatever. Mrs. Peerybingle knew it perfectly as she sat musing before the hearth. "It's a dark night," sang the kettle. "And the rotten leaves are lying by the way, and above all is mist and darkness, and below all is mire and clay. And there is only one relief in all the sad and murky air, and I don't know that it is one, for it's nothing but a glare of deep and angry crimson, where the sun and wind together set a brand upon the clouds for being guilty of such weather. And the widest open country is a long, dull streak of black. And there's hoarfrost on the finger post, and thaw upon the track. And the ice, it isn't water, and the water isn't free. And you couldn't say that anything is what it ought to be, but he's coming, coming, coming.